So what are we talking about today? Well, all of our digital mixers use MIDI. MIDI is a form of messaging, so there's no audio involved, unlike everything else we talk about. It's just control messages that are being sent between pieces of equipment. It's been around since the early 80s, I think 1982 is when it came around, and it was initially for synthesizers to talk to each other. It's since been appropriated by many other forms of musical equipment and lighting and other stuff as well. And that's because it's incredibly efficient. And it's just a series of messages, a series of small bits of data that fly around between the equipment, and it's a standard. So lots of equipment can talk to one another. With our consoles, it can broadly be split into two parts. So there's MIDI that you send out from a console, which is a standard form of MIDI. So you have CC messages, they come from fader controllers and also from soft rotaries and soft key note on and off and things like that. And then you also have more in-depth control that controls the mixer itself. So that's actually affecting what you're doing with the mixer. We're just going to be talking today a little bit about the DAW Control Driver, which is super useful. We're not going to get too in-depth with anything that's actually DAW control though. So with DAW control, there's some instructions on our website of how to set that up. And really, you don't need to know a lot about MIDI to get that working. We'll explain what it does, but it's that one's quite straightforward, so we won't get too in-depth with that. We've got a little presentation that we'll run through. You can also ask us questions, so there is a little question box that you'll see on your screen, and if you use that, you can ask us questions. We'll try and answer them live. If we don't get around to them live, we will get back to you at the end of the webinar or after the webinar, maybe tomorrow, but within the next day or so. Yeah. So please don't be afraid to ask any questions. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover. So we're actually going to cover for D-Live, SQ and Q. Obviously D-Live our flagship range, Q are kind of coming from analog, a bit more entry-level digital, and SQ which sits somewhere in between the two. Other consoles also use MIDI, but these are the ones we're going to concentrate on because they cover pretty much everything you would need to know. I should also say at this point there are protocol documents available for each of these which you can download from our website. We'll be talking about MIDI in a general sense and talking about what the messages look like and what they do, not so much about the specifics of each mixer. We'll use some examples, but the MIDI protocol document is really going to be your Bible if you start getting into using some MIDI control. So we've got different connections and how you get MIDI to and from a console. The different types of MIDI that we're using. Alex is going to run through some terminology as well and stuff that you'll see in the MIDI protocol documents. I'll talk a little bit about the differences between the ranges and why that is. We'll touch on third-party control, and then we'll get into some examples of some of the most useful stuff as the bank and program changes. NRPN, which is non-registered parameter number, which is what we use to control the mixer itself. And then we'll have a quick look at the DAW Control Driver and look at some examples. Another thing I should say is, along with the protocol documents, another really useful thing to do is get something like MIDI Monitor on Mac or MIDI aux or MIDI OX on Windows. And these allow you to monitor the signals that are being sent between different bits of equipment. We'll actually be using MIDI Monitor today to show you some of the messages that are being sent and received by different things. So without further ado, I'll let you start going on this list.
Cool. Right, so hello everyone. First thing we're going to have a little look at is connections. So on our mixers we have either a USB port, and so there's a USB port on Q and SQ, or you can use the network port, which uses TCP/IP. Don't worry if you're not sure what that is. It's just a way of transporting the MIDI over a network that we use. So, for example, today we've got an SQ here, and that's connected with an Ethernet cable out of the network port and into our MacBook Pro here. And that's how we're communicating this laptop with the mixer. Some other connections you might come across is 5-pin DIN connectors, and we'll talk a little bit later about how you can connect hardware that uses that connector with our mixers. And yeah, you can also do all of the same thing over USB in case you don't want to use your TCP connection.
So the USB, which you might know from Q and SQ, from using it for audio, will also carry MIDI. Yeah. So it's like an audio MIDI interface built into those units. MIDI over network is what you would use for D-Live, but you can also use it with the other ones. And that's, as Alex was saying, if you've got a mixer on the same network as your computer.
Yeah, cool. So all of our mixers use various types of MIDI messages. We'll go through NRPN and bank and program change messages later on, but we also have nodes on and off, MMC, which is mainly used for DAW control, control change messages, pitch bend, and system exclusive, or SysX. So SysX is slightly different to the rest of them because it's kind of a free format way of sending MIDI, whereas the others are kind of fixed format, and you can it's all very kind of laid out for you with the rest of them. We'll also have a look at some terminology now. So we have MIDI channel. That's not to be confused with mixer channel. So the MIDI channel, there are 16 MIDI channels available, and you can think of it in the same way as broadcasting to a channel on your television. Only what you broadcast to that channel will appear, can be viewed on that channel. So the mixer channel is the actual physical input or output fader channel on your mixing desk. So yeah, it's just kind of, don't confuse the two. And in fact, something that was mentioned from the previous webinar is bank change. You might be familiar with kind of layers, and you might call those banks, or you might have a kind of bank of faders. This is a bank change message, which is a MIDI message. It's a kind of type of MIDI message. So again,
yeah, there is a lot of shared terminology between mixers and MIDI, obviously, because it's all to do with similar things.
Yeah.
But yeah, like Alex says, there's 60 MIDI channels per port, and you can have lots of ports as well. So again, going back, I'm just going to keep bringing it back to 1982, yeah. But you'd have a single 5-pin DIN MIDI cable, and you'd be able to daisy chain a bunch of equipment, send the control from one, and choose where you're sending it to. So that's where those channels come from.
We also have MSB and LSB. So those actually relate to NRPN messages specifically, and they're kind of manufacturer specified controls. So they stand for most significant byte and least significant byte. So we specify what each of those bytes are controlling. And then you also have coarse value and fine value. Your coarse value is 1 to 128 steps within that message, and then the fine value is 1 to 128 steps within each coarse step. Keith might have a number for how many steps that actually is. I think it's
16,384.
There we go. So that's quite a lot of steps. It's very high resolution. So that's something that our SQ makes use of. So you might come across that if you're using MIDI with your SQ. There's also different ways to display MIDI, different formats. So we have binary, decimal, and hexadecimal. Our mixers generally use hexadecimal. All of our protocols are displayed in hexadecimal. I might call it hex. Decimal is quite commonly used on things like MIDI Footswitches. Some MIDI programs use decimal. Binary is less common, as it's quite a kind of raw format of MIDI data. Relative MIDI is that is actually increasing or decreasing from whatever position you are, whatever value you start on, and absolute is a fixed value. So if you've got a fader at a value and then you turn it up, it starts from that value that you're already at. If you're on relative, then it doesn't matter where the fader is, you're kind of controlling it from that point, wherever it already is. Hope that makes sense. Just to kind of give you a bit more visual representation on how MIDI is kind of displayed, this is how hexadecimal, decimal, and binary is displayed. Hexadecimal is starting from 0. Generally, all MIDI starts from 0, and up to F. So that's 16 characters, and you can go from 00 to FF, and that's 256 steps. Decimal is displayed in numerical increments, so starting from 0 up to 127 or 256, depending on what kind of system you're using. And then binary is just lots of ones and zeros for you to get your head around.
So these are all just different forms of counting, really. They all display, as you can see in this table, it's all the same data that's there and same information that's being passed through. You're just counting it in different ways. So with binary, you can only count by 1. So if you're familiar with binary, it is very confusing to look at. With decimal, that's our normal way of counting. Like base 10 counting, basically. And then hexadecimal, you've got 0 to 9 and then A, B, C, D, E, F. And we use hexadecimal in all our documentation, so that is what we will be using today as well.
Yeah, we will reference to decimal where it's applicable, but generally we'll be talking in hex. So moving on.
So there's three ones that we're talking about today. There are differences in the MIDI protocol for each, and that kind of comes from the fact that they're different mixers, so they have different needs. With Q, for example, if you've got Q16, you've got 16 mono inputs plus 3 stereo inputs. So that's, you don't need to control a huge amount there. Although with Q, we also used MIDI for the app initially. So that has a huge amount of different parameters you can control. Then if you move up to, if you jump to DLive, for example, you've got 128 inputs. So you can still control a lot of different parameters with that, but you've got a lot more channels. That is not MIDI channels, that's mixed channels.
Mixed channels.
So you've got a lot more mixed channels to control, and that then spills out into multiple MIDI channels because there's so many different parameters that you need to control. And then with SQ, we actually did something a little bit different because we didn't need to control every aspect of the mixer. So what we've been able to do there is add in absolute and relative control. You can also have a fine control of the levels. So you've got that 16,384 steps in a level control. And you can also do things like toggling switches. So if you can send the same message multiple times, and it will switch it'll switch something on and off, and just keep toggling that. So
it just kind of makes it a little bit simpler in a lot of ways, and a lot more control. But we'll go through all of that in a minute.
There's also third-party control. Now this we're not going to get into because again you don't need to know that much about MIDI to use it. These are modules that use our MIDI protocol that you can download from our website. So if you just head to the website, head to the software section on any of the products there, and you can go down. If you go down to the bottom, I think it's just at the bottom actually, there's a link there that will take you, and you can download those modules for Crestron, AMX, Extron needs, and then just plug them in and start using them. So again, we're not going to go too much into detail with that, but they are using MIDI.
So those are kind of pre-configured, but we're actually going to take you through how to configure MIDI strings with your console. Cool. So let's get straight onto it. Here is a message for a scene recall that you could use on SQ and DLive. As we mentioned, there is differences between the mixes, but there's also some commonalities. So this message would work on both an SQ and a DLive. If we break that down into how many messages and the different message types. Message 1 is actually a bank select or a bank change message, and message 2 is a program change message. So I've pointed out there where the MIDI channel is selected. So your first character there, which let's say on message 1 is B, that's actually showing that it's a control change message, and in this instance it's being used to select the bank, and the next character there is selecting the MIDI channel. So you could have 0, or you could have for MIDI channel 1, or you could have F for MIDI channel 16, and that's how you select your MIDI channel within the MIDI string, which will be useful for later on. The next kind of variable within that message is where I've labeled bank. So as I said earlier, all MIDI starts from 0. So this is actually selecting bank 1. If you wanted to select bank 3, for example, you would put 0, 2 there. Next, you have a C message, which depicts a program change. And you would also put your MIDI channel after that character, and then you select your program. So with banks, and this is a bank change, not a fader bank, you have access to up to 128 programs, and in this instance a program is a scene. So you can access 128 scenes within your mixer on one bank. If you need to access the next 128 scenes, you need to move up to the next bank, and then you start from 0. So
again, it's just counting really, that it's going up to 128, change bank, go up to 128.
Exactly, yeah.
So for SQ, you've got 3 banks because you've got 300 scenes.
Yeah.
So to cover all of those scenes, you need access to 3 banks.
Exactly, yeah. If we move on, Q does things slightly differently. So you have 2 bank messages. However, you don't need to change the bank because the Q only has 100 scenes, so you only need 1 bank. And then again, you just select the scene using the program byte on the end. Something that's good to know at this stage is with Q, you only need to send the bank message once. Because it's only using 1 bank, it's unlikely that you'll need to try and recall a scene that doesn't exist. So on the other mixers, it's good practice to always send the bank message, because you don't want to accidentally recall a scene in a different bank that by mistake. So on Q, it's less important, but on SQ and D Live, it is rather important.
But it's best practice to have those bank change messages in there
all the time anyway, just in case. Yeah. So let's move on to NRPN. So
it's getting more difficult.
Yeah. Yep. Look at that. So NRPN is a longer string, as you can see, and in this example we're going to be moving a single channel to a specific level in a specific mix. So let's go through how you do that. NRPN could be sent via sysx, and in that sysx kind of box, you might just put in all of the characters and it looks like one big message. You could also send it as multiple control change messages. So in this instance, we're using 4 messages. On D Live, which we'll go through in a minute, it actually uses 3. And messages 1 and 2 are used for the MSB and LSB, which we spoke about earlier. And messages 3 and 4 are the coarse value and fine value. In this example, the MSB is actually relating to the mix and the LSB is relating to the channel. I'm just telling you this so that it kind of breaks it down and it's a little bit easier to understand. You might look at the protocol and see kind of MSB and LSB and not really sure what they mean, but this is just what we've assigned those channels to control and tell the mixer what to control. So if we have a look at a D-Live string, again, it's slightly shorter message. As I mentioned, it's actually only 3 messages. I've changed the MIDI channel here to kind of give you an example of how you actually change the MIDI channel there. And also on D-Live, we've chosen for the MSB and LSB to be slightly different. So MSB actually relates to the mixer channel, and LSB relates to the ID, parameter ID. So 17 or 17 actually relates to the level for the left and right mix, and we might change that ID to control different things. So you have a lot more parameters available to you than other kind of MIDI formats. Yeah. So I hope that kind of made sense. I know we have quite a few questions already, so we thought we'd kind of answer some questions. There's a lot of information there.
It's good to break it down though, because it is you've got these big long strings and they do look horrible, but when you break them down, they're actually just a set of messages. It's just like a language really, but a very simple language. So yeah, we have got some questions. Will this presentation be available for reference later? Yes. If you pop us an email to support@allen-heath.com or through support.allen-heath.com and ask, you can have this presentation, and I think we'll do a recording as well. Why is scene 71 program number 46?
That is a great question. So program 46, I want to remind you that we're actually talking in hex here. So there's, for every increment of 1, so let's say it's 10 to 40, right? That's actually 16 steps. Yeah, so if you need to count up in 16s here, and it's displayed differently. So if I put that as 4F, you wouldn't be talking about 4F. As a scene, it's a higher number.
So 1 obviously is 00 you spoke about. 201. 302. So that second digit, which will be your units if you're counting decimal, counts up to 9, and then it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, and then the kind of 10 digit, if you like. So like when you're counting to 10, when you get to 10, you add on that extra 1. It's a bit like that, except you're changing that second digit, and that's also going by 16s. So it does look a bit confusing. You can get tables though, and there's actually websites out there that you can just type in a number that you want to get as hex, and it will just send you back what it is in hex. So it can be confusing, but you can just translate it quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I have a kind of website which is just simply a table of all of the values that I use to reference quite quickly, because again, it is common to come across both hex and decimal. So it's just a quick search for decimal to hexadecimal converter should find that. Should come up.
So thanks for that, Rich. Good question. Will there ever be OSC support added to SQ? So I'll take this one.
Go for it.
Yeah, that's from Nathaniel. OSC is kind of clunky. Like it's really, we're saying the difficulties here is with reading it. Once you can read it and once you understand what's going on, it's actually very powerful and will do pretty much the same thing, but in a much more efficient way. With OSC, you've got to decode those messages that you're sending through because you've got a huge string of text. So you might say, send level channel 1 to mix 1 at -10. I think it's one of the examples we used, or +10. And that's like a really long string of stuff, whereas we're just saying the same thing, but just very succinctly, just this channel, that mix.
Yeah. So although OSC is more human readable, it's not actually as fast, I guess, as MIDI displayed in this way. From a kind of programming point of view, it's quicker to decode and actually do something with.
And these messages that we're talking about today, the MIDI messages that are sent into the console and responded to by the console and sent out as well, that's all part of the control side of any of our mixes. So you're kind of interrupting, I suppose, but you're putting extra traffic in on that. So we like to keep it very simple and efficient and straightforward and fast.
Yeah.
So what else have we got here? There's another one. Oh, this is
it's a long question.
That is a long question. We might have to get back to that one afterwards. Jonathan, we will email you back on that one because that looks like you need a good detailed answer.
Yeah. Maybe
there's another one, just one quick one here, because Baz is asking if it's possible to sync the MIDI clock to the delay effects of SQ7. There's no MIDI clock being sent for the same reasons, actually, of interruption. But what you can do is send out tap tempos. And another thing you can do with SQ, if you look through the protocol, is to trigger any of the soft keys by MIDI. So you can send MIDI messages into the SQ, and you're doing kind of a virtual key press. So anything you can do, like tap tempos, for example, you can assign a MIDI message to trigger the key, and then assign the key to trigger the tap tempo. So anything you can do on a soft key, you can do via MIDI with an SQ.
Cool. Okay, if you have any more questions, do send them through. We'll have a kind of chance at the end to answer some more. If we don't get around to them, then we'll get back to you imminently.
Do some live demos.
Yeah, so let's go on to
It's always risky doing live demos.
Quickly first, though, we are going to have a talk about the DAW Control Driver. So this is an application that we provide.
It's free to download from our website.
Yep, and you can use it to interface your computer with your mixer. The DLive requires this to actually access MIDI. So because it only uses TCP, it only uses the network port. SQ and Q both also require this for DAW control, and you can also use it for MIDI through and our CC translator. So HUI, Mackie control are protocols used generally for DAW control. We're not going to look at those today, but if you do need a hand with any of that, do ask questions to our email, support@allen-heath.com. We'll be more than happy to help. But yeah, MIDI through is just a straight pass through of all data that the mixer sends out. And the CC translator is just simple controls, simplified controls, which we'll go through in a bit more detail.
They're very useful, those maps.
Yeah, thank you. I spent a lot of time on them. So let's go straight on to some kind of use cases, and we'll do a little kind of demo on how it works. So first thing I wanted to demonstrate was DLive in QLab. So it's quite often that you'll want to do either scene changes or maybe level changes on QLab, and we're going to actually have a look at a level change in this scenario. With NRPN and DLive, you have 3 separate messages. So you could send this message using sysx and just type out the characters as it is displayed in the protocol. Or you can use 3 separate control change messages and configure them to send out the exact same message. As I've kind of labeled here, the first message selects the channel, second message selects the parameter, and the third message is the fader value. And that's exactly how we've got it displayed there. It's 3 separate messages, and that's what each message is doing. There is a slight problem with this. Now, a lot of people, especially in theatre and that sort of scenario, would like to be able to do a level change and actually fade it over a period of time from one position to another. Now, there is a problem with that because first of all, you would only fade the fader value. The reason being that you wouldn't want to fade all of them is that you would start selecting different parameters and different channels. So you only want the fader value to be
an interesting effect.
It would be a very interesting effect, but not necessarily desired. So yeah, so you would actually fade that last control change message there. What happens if you do that? The first two are sent once, and the last one is sent for every step, every volume step. Now, DLive has actually been configured to still register those steps, even though the first two messages are only sent once. However, if you've got multiple faders all changing at the same time, it doesn't work. The first messages are sent and the first value is sent, and then you actually end up just controlling the last fader controlled, and so it just doesn't work properly. So to help with that, we've started using the CC translator map on the DAW Control Driver. So I'm going to show you how that works. Show preferences. So what I'll do is I'll show you what actually happens with it not working. So at the moment, I've got this configured to send out the correct message. If I turn this one off for a minute and send this message, you can see that it's sending out the correct message. So that's all fine. That should work.
So just quickly, I'll jump in. That's MIDI monitor there that Alex has got on his screen.
This one here.
And you can use that to spy on outputs to other destinations, as you can see there. So
yeah, it's a really useful little tool. You can use it as also a destination for other programs. If you don't have the mixer with you and you just want to make sure everything's working correctly, then yeah. So if I then do this fade over duration option and send the message again, we have a big old fade going from +10 to -infinity. These first three messages are correct, but those first two messages aren't sent again. It's only that last one that is sent multiple times. Yeah. So this isn't exactly what you want. You would like, especially if you're doing it with multiple channels at the same time, you want each channel to be individually controlled and each increment to be controlled correctly. So if I change this one to be the CC translator now, we can see that these two, the port has disappeared because I've changed it, and this one has assigned to the new port. And the way I've set this up is for the channel, which is the MIDI channel, to still correspond to the MIDI channel, the control number to correspond to the mixer channel, and the control value to still control the level. So for example, if I change this to 127 and I'll take it off fade over duration.
So I noticed there as well, you've got translator faders as the MIDI destination.
Yeah, so it creates multiple ports, and I can show you what those look like. So in your show control software, you'll see two ports become available, and one is for mute and one is for faders. On the different models, so on Q and SQ, the ports might differ slightly. So you might have an outputs and an inputs, and this is just to accommodate how each mixer works kind of differently. But yeah, so for this example, it's CC translator faders for DLive. So yeah, if I send this value, you have a single No, you don't. There you go. You have a single message there, and that's sending the exact same control to the mixer. It's just translating that simple message there into the 3 separate messages using an NRPN to the mixer. So it just kind of simplifies it down, and it's a bit quicker to actually configure. If I then enable this fade over duration, you'll see that it's that one message, and it's incrementing correctly.
So then the DAW Control Driver will translate those messages into the NRPN messages that we looked at earlier, so you don't have to worry about doing all the crazy NRPN messages.
Exactly. So it's just the mixer MIDI being translated into a different format that's easier to configure and easier to kind of understand.
And you can use it for fades.
And you can use it for fades, and it works nicely. So
cool.
So yeah, it works as expected, and you can automate multiple faders at once. The next kind of demo we're going to have a look at is SQ and Waves MultiRack. So we know that a lot of users of our mixers are using Waves, especially live and in the studio. And I thought it'd be quite cool for us to look at how you could control your plugins in MultiRack using the mixer. So you actually have your kind of hardware controls. I'm kind of focusing on SQ for this one because it has the kind of dedicated soft rotaries. However, it is kind of important to note that all of these demonstrations are actually applicable to all 3 mixers. You can actually do the same thing on DLive and Q, and yeah, so I think that's kind of important.
So with the MIDI channel strips that you've got on Q and on DLive and some of our other consoles as well, and on SQ even, you are sending just standard CC messages from the console over USB and TCP/IP. So you can use this same method if you don't have soft rotaries to use those MIDI faders to control these parameters if you want.
So this is what the kind of preferences of MultiRack looks like. You select your MIDI port, and you also have this MIDI pickup mode, which is quite important, and I'll show you why it's important a little bit later. And then you can actually open the editor and assign your controls. So when you open the editor, it will come up blank if you've not looked at it before, and then once you've assigned your controls, you can see how it's actually what's actually assigned to the different controls. So what I'll do is hopefully
see if it'll work.
Yeah. So if I show the preferences here again, I'm going to change it to an SQ, and I've actually got an SQ here. So as you saw then, it saw that my SQ6 is available over TCP. I'm also going to change that to MIDI through because I just want the MIDI that the mixer is sending out to just go straight through to MultiRack. Connect, and it's connected. And now I'm going to launch MultiRack SoundGrid to make sure that all of the ports that I've just configured are available. Otherwise, I'd have to restart MultiRack, and it wouldn't if I changed the ports.
So the DAW Control Driver is creating virtual ports kind of on the fly as you're changing these settings.
Yeah.
So there's certain bits of software that won't see them, that they'll look for the MIDI ports when they start up.
Yeah.
Basically. Okay.
So I'm going to add a rack here, and yeah, and then I'm going to add 76. I'm actually going to add 2 76s so you can see how it works, and wait for it to load.
Really slamming that. Whatever it might be.
Whatever it is,
yeah.
it needs a lot of work. And so yeah, there's the plugin. Now, if I go into our preferences window, so I've actually already set this up, but I'll go through it again. So you select your port and make sure that's enabled. You make sure you've got takeover selected, and then you can open the editor. And this is one I made earlier, but I'll start a new one and show you how it's configured. So if I select that parameter, I've got my SQ down here. So I'm just going to turn the soft rotary that I want that to control, and you can see that it's assigned. If I do the same thing for these, and those controls are now assigned in MultiRack.
So
I also, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, so this process would be the same if you've got a learn mode in some other software.
Yeah, so Ableton has like a kind of MIDI learn, and so does Logic.
NI, a lot of NI.
Yeah,
stuff
so you can use the same kind of method with your SQ if you're using it in the studio, and so this is just kind of a kind of application that you might come across. I'm also going to assign the buttons underneath the soft rotaries. So if I just do that now, and that's done. And then you can save it, and you then have to load it. So I'm not going to save them because I've already done it. We have my kind of default that I've set up here already loaded. So if I press OK and open this one, when I turn this, it's now actually controlling the plugin. And what I'll do is if I turn that all the way up and go to the next plugin, you can see that the two controls, so this same soft rotary is actually controlling the same parameter on the two different plugins, and they're both at different values. So this is where the takeover mode comes in. If I now turn the value, it doesn't actually change anything yet until I reach that point. So for example, if I
so it stops it from jumping.
Exactly. So
as soon as you send a message.
If I go back into my preferences and into the MIDI thing and go back to none.
Break it.
So that one's on full. This one's not. So if I change that, it's now jumped to the previous setting. That's not what you want in a live show. You don't want that massive change, especially if you're using different plugins that those controls are assigned differently. So I'm going to put that straight back onto takeover before something bad happens. Cool. So that's how you actually set up MultiRack. That went relatively well. So I'm going to close that.
Save it.
I don't need to save it. It was so easy to set up. I'm going to quit that one and go back to our presentation. So that's how you set that one up. Something I'd like to go over quickly is the control network bridge option on SQ. I think it's also available on DLive. What this does is if you have an I/O card plugged into your mixer, you can tunnel any data that would go to the network port through your I/O card. So if you've got a Waves system or a Dante system, you can tunnel MIDI over your network card. And it works exactly the same for DAW control and all your standard MIDI. And yeah, it's just quite a neat one cable
solution.
So
it's like a switch, a network switch, I suppose.
Yeah.
Or connecting up the network port. And it's just data, right?
Yeah,
it's no audio or anything.
No audio. Yeah, all the audio is still going through the through the card, so it's just sending that data via the card as well. And the DAW Control Driver picks it all up in the exact same way, and it will see the mixer if it's available. Cool. The last, see, we're getting on for time, so the last kind of example we're going to go over is Q and MIDI Footswitches. So the MIDI Footswitches generally either use USB or a 5-pin DIN connection. And so how would you actually connect this to the Q? I should also say the Q doesn't have a dedicated foot switch socket. Only the QSB does. So this is actually something we get requested quite a lot on how you actually set that up. We've got two options here. So if you're using a 5-pin DIN connection, you could use something like the Bome Box, which is not something we make. It's a third-party piece of hardware, and it has a 5-pin DIN connection on it. It also has a USB host connection on it and a TCP/IP port on it. So you have lots of different options there on how you can connect, and you don't need a computer attached to it.
That would work instead of the DAW Control Driver.
Yeah.
And it's got as well firmware on the Bome Box, which can connect over network, over the TCP/IP, the same as you saw with the SQ being discovered by the DAW Control Driver. The Bome Box can also discover devices.
Yeah, so they've added in into the firmware of the box to be able to auto-discover Allen Heath mixes. Or you could use a laptop or PC to connect between the two. Generally, you would do this over either USB or TCP Ethernet connection, and yeah, both are doing pretty much the same thing. You can either just straight pass through the MIDI if your foot switch allows you to kind of configure it to send out the right message, or you can use some kind of program to translate it. I know MIDI can do a kind of similar thing. The Bome Box has a built-in translator available, and yeah, so it doesn't matter what your foot switch actually sends out. It can.
So the Bome site's a good one to check out actually, because they have got the classic translator, and then they've got the new fancy new shiny translator as well. And with the newer one, you can create a translation, little mini translation programs, and load your own one onto the box.
Yeah.
So you can use any bit of MIDI hardware to send any kind of MIDI message to any of our mixes. And
we should point out that it's not just MIDI foot switches. You can use any piece of MIDI hardware to connect to your mixer and control it. Cool. So let's have a look at some examples. In this one, I've done a scene change, so it'd be a kind of program change. I don't know whether I've just skipped. No. So I've displayed it in decimal, because quite often MIDI foot switches will be displayed in decimal. So we're selecting MIDI channel 1. The type is the program change, and the value is 64, so that will actually be recalling scene 65 because we're displaying in decimal. If it was hexadecimal, you'd see a hexadecimal equivalent to that value. Yep. So if I go over to this one, I've set this up to be a kind of similar setup. Looks like I might have closed my DAW Control Driver, so let's get that one back up. See how fast that was? And we'll go on TCP. Okay, so it's a MIDI through at the moment. It's still communicating with the DAW Control port, which is the virtual port that the DAW Control Driver creates. I've then selected this to be program change, and you can select your channel and select your program number, just as you are likely to on your MIDI foot switch. If then I select 64 and send that, I can see that it's actually sending the correct message as in accordance with the MIDI protocol document.
So that's the message I actually saw earlier, wasn't it?
Yeah. So if I change this now to a note on message, this is exactly the same way. You have your note number, which is your channel number on the mixer. So let's say I want to control channel 1, which if you look at the document, that will be hex 20 and decimal 32. Velocity, you want that to be 127 for maximum velocity which corresponds to a note on. So if I now send that, it's a 7F velocity and 20 hex. If you want it to be a note off, I think it's 63. Yep. And so that's now sending out a note off message. Of course, with the program change and the note on messages, this isn't exactly what's written in the protocol. So with the program change, you should be sending bank messages as well. And with the note messages, you should be sending a note on followed by a note off for Q. It will work in the way I've just shown you, but it's not best practice. But we understand that not all hardware sends out exactly what we want it to. So we have made it kind of work still in that way.
And with the note on, note off, there's two types of note off with MIDI. So you have a note on followed by an explicit note off, or you have a note on followed by a note on with 0 velocity.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's two standards.
The second, the latter of those two are is what's used by the DLive, and the prior is what's used by the Q. I'm not sure if that's you'll likely know.
I can't remember.
I think it's note on by note on.
They're both part of the standard.
Yeah.
But with that velocity where it was 127 for on and 63 for off, that's halfway. So you've just split it up into two sections. So anything above 64 should be on, and anything below or 63 or below, which is actually 64 when you count from 0, it should be off.
Yeah. Cool. So I have got a slide on what I just showed you, but it's exactly the same. So we've got the channel, the type, and the velocity, and that's how it might be displayed on your foot switch.
Cool.
Then we've got a little slide on the Bome Box if you wanted any more details on that, but I think we've got quite a few questions to go through. So I'll just leave that up on the screen and you can have a little look whilst we answer some questions.
So, will Allen Heath adopt the upcoming MIDI 2 standards? That's from Dinday. MIDI 2.0 came out fairly recently. If you think we take a while for updates on our consoles, they've taken about 30 years for the update on that. No, it's brilliant. The reason MIDI is so good actually and so endearing and been going for so long is because they did it really, really well to start with, and you don't need more than that. They kind of factored in a lot extra. I can't say for sure whether or not we would be adopting any of the standards. It depends whether we would find it useful or applicable to what we're doing or what we want to offer with our mixes, or what you guys want as well from our mixes and from MIDI. So look at that. What does Mackie Control Alt Display mean? That's from Douglas. Hi, Douglas.
Hi, Douglas. So the alt display actually corresponds to different DAWs who handle it differently. So most DAWs might actually, Keith described it in a really good way earlier. So on some Mackie Control hardware, you have a screen with 2 lines on it, and the alt display reverses those lines. That's kind of the easiest way to think about it. On the SQ, you have a single line of text. So yeah, it depends what the DAW is sending out and in which order.
Yeah, so we built in 1.4 for SQ the ability for the DAW Control Driver to pass through the naming from the DAW and display it on the scribble strips. So when you've got your MIDI scribble strips set up and you're using bank up and down, it'll automatically update those names and you have something to reference to. But as Alex says, there's the 2 lines of text on a real Mackie control, and we have just 1 line of text to work with. So the alt display just uses the opposite line.
Yeah.
So look here. Try and find some more. Can I only map soft rotaries to plug-in controllers or also faders? Christian, you can use the faders as well. So the MIDI channel strips that you can assign on all our mixers, they just send MIDI CC data. So
not the input channel strips, the MIDI fader strips that you would use for DAW control.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got 32 MIDI channel strips available. and MIDI channel strip 1 from the fader sends CC1, I believe.
CC0.
Or CC0. Okay, fine. Ones and zeros.
Always start from 0 in MIDI.
And let's see if there's any more that we can answer quickly now before we're over. So this is from Edwin. Do I understand correctly to use the CC translator for QLab?
So you can use CC translator with lots of things. It depends what you want to do with it. You can use it with DAWs if you wanted to just send out automation data from it. But yes, it is kind of designed specifically for automation software such as QLab, and purely for that, controlling lots of different channels at the same time. I don't know whether this has been asked, but it was asked in the previous webinar about having scene control within the CC translator. It's not in there at the moment, but it is something I'd really like to add in the near future. So watch the space for that.
Okay, cool. And there's lots of other stuff you can do as well. I see there's a couple of questions here about surround sound. Yes, you can do some surround sound. I've messed around a little bit with doing some surround sound using Q and SQ, but controlling it via MIDI. So you're controlling multiple channels with one control, or you're sending multiple messages of those NRPN messages. So you can do some kind of fake surround stuff, I suppose, with that, or some fun stuff with it. I know, Alex, you've also been working on a controller kind of skin for Q, which is using those NRPN messages. Yeah,
so I've been working on a few different things, such as the CC translator maps. One other thing, well, a couple of other things I've been working on is a program called Controller. You can look it up, it's controller.org. It's basically a customizable interface which can control things using MIDI. So I've been playing around a little bit to try and get it working with Q as a kind of multi OS control.
That would be really cool. I think Alex is being a bit of a perfectionist on it, actually. It's probably pretty good already, but I'm sure we'll be able to share that on the digital community forums
at some point. Something else that's actually on the digital community already, if you're a Q user, is the Q MIDI generator. It's just an Excel spreadsheet that you can select your different parameters and values, and it will give you the MIDI string. So if you have a look through the community forum, or if you can't find it, send us an email, support@allen-heath.com, and I can send it to you.
Cool. One more, I think, before we go, and I will leave this open as well for questions. And as we said earlier, we will get back to all of the questions, even the ones that we haven't got around to live. And sorry if we haven't. There is a quick series of involved questions here from Philip. We're not going to answer these in great detail now, but it is an interesting point, because you're saying about having MIDI, Dante, and SQ for you coexisting simultaneously on the SQ. Yeah, absolutely. You've got a few different things going on there, but you've got Dante, which is a third-party audio protocol, and that's sending. It's over the network, but it's audio. And you've got the SQ for you, which is sending our kind of proprietary messages over the network, and you've also then got MIDI. If you've got presumably a Dante card, otherwise you wouldn't be talking about Dante, you could connect up with the control network bridge, the network port to the Dante card, and you could also have your SQFU running. So the SQFU is running over the Wi-Fi maybe and running into that network port. The MIDI can also be running through the network port or through the Dante card, and your Dante audio could also be running on its Dante network. So yes, these are all possible things.
They don't conflict with each other. They're all kind of separate things and can all work simultaneously.
Yeah, and they're all running at the same time on the SQ, kind of anyway.
Yeah,
really. Yeah, plug anything in. So yes, thank you very, very much for joining us. We are out of time now, but we will get back to those questions, and I will leave the question window open for a little bit as well. So if you think of anything else right now, just type it in and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thanks very much, guys.
Cheers. Bye.